Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to take a look at the Z1 version of the ASUS ROG Ally. Now this is the $599 model, which means it's $100 cheaper than the Z1 Extreme version, which came out earlier this year. Now I've had this for about 2 weeks of testing, and I've learned quite a few things along the way. Number one is that I am not very good at pretending to be a benchmarking YouTuber. So if you're looking for like charts and graphs and specific comparisons between the Z1 and the Z1 Extreme in terms of chipset performance, that's not going to be this video. Instead, we're going to mostly focus on the experience I've had over the past 2 weeks of using this as my main handheld PC. And the way I thought about it was that if I'm in the market for one of these handheld PCs, I would want to know what that $100 price difference is really going to mean. Does that mean I'm going to have poor performance, or I'm going to have better battery life? And so that's what we're going to cover in this video right here. We're going to go over all the things that are the same between these two models, but then also what's different. In addition, I'm going to go over all my favorite components of the ROG Ally devices in particular, and then also some of the things I don't like. And I'm hoping that by the end, you will have a good idea of whether or not the Z1 or the Z1 Extreme version is going to be a good fit for you. And so, without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive right in. Okay, to start, let's talk about what is the Z1 version of the ROG Ally. And the name refers to the chip that's within the device. The Z1 Extreme model is the one we already have in stores for $699. And that chip is essentially the equivalent of a Ryzen 7840U. And the Z1 also has an equivalent chip, and that's the Ryzen 7640U. So it is a slightly lower spec, and the main difference here is going to be the integrated graphics. The Z1 Extreme has 8 cores and 16 threads with 8.6 teraflops of overall GPU power. Meanwhile, the Z1 has 6 cores and 12 threads, but a fraction of that GPU processing power, only 2.8 teraflops. And while in the intro I did say I wasn't going to do a bunch of benchmarking, we will do some comparisons between these two later in the video. Now, in terms of the unboxing experience, it's identical to the previous model in case you have opened one of those. So I'm not really going to delve into it other than to say that it's exactly the same as I've shown in my other videos. And all the hardware components appear to be the same, including the 65-watt charging brick. And so yes, for all intents and purposes, from a hardware perspective, other than that chip, there's no difference between the Z1 Extreme and the Z1 model we're reviewing today. All the same, I do want to go over some of the major components of this device, starting with the user interface, because I think this is one of the most important elements that sets this device apart. Now, Windows devices usually have a reputation for being hard to set up, but I've found that the ROG Ally is actually pretty easy to use, at least for a Windows handheld. So let's hit the highlights of that software experience, starting with Armoury Crate, which you can bring up by pressing this button here on the right side of the screen. Now, the game library interface will compile all of the different games that you install onto your device, no matter what store you got them from. So as I scroll through, you will see in addition to my Steam games, there are Xbox games and GOG games as well. And as a note for this entire video, all of my PC games are actually running off the SD card and not the internal storage. And in my 2 weeks of testing and really pushing this device pretty hard, I didn't have any issues whatsoever with that SD card. However, that's not to say that the SD card issues have completely gone away with this device. We'll talk more about that later in the battery life section. Now, also within Armoury Crate, we do have some settings options. In this tab, we have all sorts of things we can adjust, but here's some of my favorites. Number one, we can edit the command center. This is a button that's on the left of the screen that'll bring up a quick access menu. And so if you like, you can customize this to whatever action or layout that you prefer. Additionally, within here, we have other settings options, for example, adjusting the RGB lighting around the joysticks. And then finally, on the rightmost content tab, we have a couple other options here. Probably the most important one is the update center. That's where you can go in to update Armoury Crate itself. Now, one of my favorite things about this software is that you can make per game configurations. All you have to do is press the X button while hovering over a game, and then it'll bring up a game profile. Here you can adjust things like the key mapping specific to that game, and you can also fine-tune things like the analog sticks and the triggers and the vibration intensity. In addition, you can make game-specific configurations relating to the power profile and performance mode. And that includes the AC power mode, which is when it's plugged in. And this is really handy. For example, if you're running on battery, you can have it in one performance mode, but then when you plug it in, it'll be something else. Next, we're going to bring up the command center and talk about some of the quick action menu items that we can do within here. To start, the most important for me is the performance modes. There's 3 different options that you can have, including a 4th one if you have it plugged in. Another one that's really handy is the ability to adjust the control mode between gamepad and desktop. When you switch over to desktop mode, that means that the right analog stick is going to function like a mouse cursor. And your right bumper is going to function as your left mouse button, but then the right trigger is going to be your right click. And so as you're navigating through the Windows file system, which can be a pain in the butt on some of these devices, this makes it quite a bit easier. And of course, within the quick menu, you've got all sorts of other options, like adjusting the screen resolution or the refresh rate, as well as the FPS limiter. You can also turn on a real-time monitor if you want to check your frames per second or overall battery life. Now on the back of the device, there are two different buttons, and by default, these are set up as macro functions. And what that means is if you just press on them on their own, it's not going to do anything, but if you use them in combination with a different button, it'll turn into a hotkey. For example, if you press one of those back buttons, then up on the D-pad, it'll bring up your on-screen keyboard. Or if you press right on the D-pad, it'll bring up the task viewer. If you press the back button and then down on the D-pad, it'll bring up the task manager, which is super handy if you need to close a specific app. And then finally, the back button and left will bring up the desktop, also very handy. So this is the setup I've been using to navigate through Windows a little bit more cleanly. I can basically get to any window I want without having to plug in a keyboard or a mouse. Anyway, that's the experience in a nutshell, so let's move over back to the hardware side, starting with controls. And I've always found that the controls on the ROG Ally are excellent, well, at least mostly. We'll start with the D-pad. This has a circular design, but it's actually very tactile and easy to press. And it's a lot more accurate than I was expecting. In fact, when playing platforming in retro games, it plays just fine. So I think if you want to focus on D-pad gaming, this is going to work out just fine, and it's also positioned pretty well ergonomically. I also like the shoulders and triggers on this device. They have a soft click to them and a little bit of resistance, but just feel really tactile as well. So when it comes to playing something like a first-person shooter, I actually really enjoy the experience. I primarily play these type of games with a console controller, and so because of that, I feel right at home here. Now, since the ROG Ally first released, there have been complaints about the dead zones with these controllers. And the main complaint is that if you just barely press on some of these analog sticks, it won't register the input in certain games. It turns out that Destiny 2 on the right analog stick is actually a pretty good example, because if you just wiggle it a little bit, nothing really happens on screen. Now, if you don't like that feeling and you'd like to remove any sort of dead zone, then let me show you some of the things that you could do. Number one, within the Armory Crate software, it's not going to be of much help because the dead zone's already set to 0. So all you can do within this software is just increase the dead zone, which I assume you don't want to do. However, if you load the game up through Steam and then enable Steam input, you can adjust the dead zones within here. In fact, as you move them around even slightly, they will register within the Steam software. But all the same, what this means to me is that there's probably an inherent dead zone within certain games like Destiny 2. However, if you turn on the advanced settings within Steam input, you have the ability to set up what they call anti-dead zone. So if you're playing a game that has an unwanted dead zone, what you can do is adjust this to the right, and it should fix things depending on how you tweak it. So I think when it comes down to it, I really don't have any complaints about the analog stick dead zone within the ROG Ally. As far as I can tell, it seems to be limited to the game settings and not necessarily the kernel or the overall hardware. And I've logged quite a few hours of Destiny 2 on either of my two ROG Ally devices, and it's never really been a concern for me. Now, one other thing I really like about the controls is the power button, because this has a fingerprint sensor which seems to work really well. Once you have everything set up with your Windows profile, it's as easy as just sliding your finger over that power button and it'll log you right in. There are quite a few other handhelds that do have the same functionality, but I've never really seen them work quite as good as the ROG Ally. Now, there is one element to the controls that I'm not a huge fan of, and that's the face buttons. I've talked about this quite a bit before. The buttons themselves have rubber membrane connectivity, very similar to an Xbox or a PlayStation controller. In fact, the buttons feel more like a Sony PlayStation controller than Microsoft because they're a little bit more flat. Now, my main complaint about these buttons is that they have a little bit too much wiggle or play. I feel like the amount of pivot we have in these buttons makes them feel wobbly and less accurate. And so unless you press this button dead on, it sometimes will feel like you're not fully pressing it. It's not the end of the world. I would say I'd give these maybe a 6 out of 10 altogether, but I do wish they were just a little bit more tight inside the shell. Next, I want to briefly talk about ergonomics, because I think they are also excellent on this device, at least mostly. To start, this is definitely a comfortable handheld. I think the contours here really do fit your hand pretty well. When you first pick it up, it might feel a little bit odd, but what I recommend doing is rotating your wrist inward just a tiny bit, and it usually will kind of fall into place. And so while the angles on this device might not look super ergonomic, once you get it in your hands and get a feel for it, they actually do fit pretty well. There's plenty of space on the back for all of your fingers, although admittedly, I often will press those back buttons with my middle fingers accidentally. However, like I mentioned before, by default, these are set up as hotkeys, so if you just press them on their own, they won't actually do anything. Now, I do have one minor complaint about the Ally, and that is that the handheld itself does feel a little bit flat. And even then, I wouldn't consider this to be a bad thing. It's just the fact that my expectations are that it would be a little bit more rounded. A lot of that comes from using more rounded console controllers over the years. But again, I wouldn't count this as a negative against the ROG Ally itself. It's still a very comfortable handheld. In fact, it's one of the few handheld PCs that I've found that I never really get fatigued when using. This is a device that I can play for hours on end. Some of that has to do with the fact that it's a little bit more lightweight than the Steam Deck. It's only 608 grams, which is 10% lighter than the Steam Deck as well. So overall, I think this is a good balance. We have some nice roomy and ergonomic controls, but then also it's not super heavy either. And finally, the last hardware components I want to touch on are the screen and sound. We'll start with the screen first. This is a 7-inch display with a 1080p resolution with a 16:9 aspect ratio. This means it's going to work great for basically any PC game under the sun, and also if you want to emulate some of the more modern systems, those that run at a 16:9 aspect ratio, it'll be a perfect fit as well. This is also a very color accurate and vibrant screen, which I think looks very good in person. In addition, the screen is anti-glare, which makes it really easy to use in well-lit conditions. Now, if you want to play older systems, those that are in a 4:3 aspect ratio, you will get pillar boxing on the left and right. And this is kind of par for the course with 16:9 aspect ratio displays, so nothing really big here. Now, one of the main selling points of the ROG Ally devices is that they run at a 120 Hz refresh rate. That means if you want to play some lightweight games that support all the way up to 120 frames per second, you can do that here on the screen. Of course, just based on performance limitations, I wouldn't expect to play any sort of AAA games at this high refresh rate, but for the lightweight games, it can be done. Now, another important component of this screen is that it has a variable refresh rate and it's FreeSync compatible. And that variable refresh rate will kick in when you have 120 Hz turned on and then you're playing something at 48 frames per second or higher. And essentially what that will do is smooth out the entire gameplay experience. We're going to use this game right here called Enslaved Odyssey to the West as our example. At 1080p in low settings, if we put it in performance mode, which is about a 15-watt TDP, we'll get a pretty stable 60 frames per second. So when you're playing like this, you don't really need to use that variable refresh rate at all. It's just going to be locked in at 60. However, when you're using a 15-watt TDP like this, it's going to pull about 20 watts of total package power. And with a 40-watt-hour battery, that means you're going to get essentially 2 hours of gameplay when playing at these settings. Now, on the flip side, if we want to use that 120 Hz mode but a lower power profile, we can also do that. So here we're playing that exact same game but in silent mode, which is going to be about a 9 or 10 watt TDP. This is going to cause the frame rate to dip well below 60 frames per second, but it stays above 48. What that means is that even though the frame rate is kind of going all over the place, it's still going to be a very smooth experience. And as an added bonus, the total package power is about 13 or 14 watts. So in this scenario, we'll get well over 3 hours of gameplay, but with the exact same 1080p low settings. And that's kind of the beauty of the variable refresh rate, is that no matter what, as long as it's getting over 48 frames per second, you personally will have a smooth gameplay experience. And as it stands right now, this is the only handheld PC on the market that can do this little trick. And I found it to be really handy when I'm trying to save as much battery life as possible, but still get a really smooth gameplay experience above 48 frames per second. Next, I want to test out the audio quality, which I think is one of the best in class when it comes to these handheld PCs. And part of that has to do with the fact that we have front-firing speakers, which means the audio is going to go straight into your ears. It sounds great. So when it comes down to it from a hardware perspective, I'm very happy with the ROG Ally. This is exactly the same as how it was with the Z1 Extreme. Next, we're going to answer the question about whether or not this one in particular is worth that $599 price point. And the number one factor here is going to be performance. And before we get started, let me walk you through the metrics you'll see on the screen here on the top left. At the top, we have our GPU utilization. Right below that will be the temperature of the GPU. And then next we have our VRAM utilization. Below that, we have our TDP, which is going to be pulled from the GPU. Below that, we have our CPU utilization, then our RAM utilization, all the way up through 16 gigabytes, but bearing in mind that the VRAM also will take some of that away. On the next line, we have our graphics backend and then our frames per second. Finally, below that, we have our power stats. So we have our battery remaining here in a percentage, and then also the number of watt hours we have remaining on the battery as well. Below that, we have an estimated time remaining with the battery. And then finally, we have our total package power. When it's plugged in, you will see a positive number like this. And then once it's plugged, you will see how many watts are draining from the battery at any given time. That's going to be your most accurate representation of figuring out how much power is being demanded by any certain game. Now, usually I start with the most lightweight game, but we're going to start with Starfield just because I use that as my example. Now, my first couple weeks of testing, I was just using it at 720p low settings. And as you can see, the performance is not super good. We're getting less than 30 frames per second on average when outdoors, but then once we're indoors, usually we'll get well over 30 frames per second, usually hovering around 35 on average. Of course, bear in mind this is a recent release, and so there's a lot of optimizations that still need to happen both on the driver side as well as with the game itself. In addition, the Starfield community has been stepping in to provide their own improvements. For example, there's a settings mod file which will give you increased visual settings as well as increased performance. And it's a very simple setup, it's actually just a matter of swapping out one file. I'll leave it linked down below. And I have to say that after making that mod change, it's been a night and day difference. I've really enjoyed playing Starfield on this device. I'm still playing it at a 720p resolution. I know there are like 900p mods out there, but I'm not really sure that this chipset can really handle it. Either way, with this setup, I've been having a great time with Starfield. So now let's actually move over to the lightweight games and talk about that as we work our way up. And as expected, when you play these lightweight games, you can usually run them in silent mode, which is going to be a 9 or a 10 watt TDP, and even push them to 120 frames per second. This is very similar to how it is on the Z1 Extreme model, so I've really not found any sort of difference here. Now, when moving up to like the Xbox 360 era, most of these will have to be played in performance mode, but you can usually get away with 1080p and maybe medium settings. And I found that unless you're playing really lightweight or indie games, you will probably have to use the performance mode for most other games. And that's especially true if you want to try to play any of these games at a 1080p resolution. So this is usually the setting that I will use if I'm playing a PC game that's maybe a few years older or a little bit lightweight. However, the performance mode will not be able to play everything at a full 60 frames per second at 1080p. A good example here is going to be Stray. On the other ROG Ally, the Z1 Extreme model, I could play this one at 1080p low settings and I would get an average of about 50 frames per second. However, here we're hovering around 35, so we've got a few options. Number one, we can adjust the resolution. So for example, with Hi-Fi Rush, we had similar issues, so I went with 720p medium settings. And this resulted in a pretty stable 60 frames per second, just with a little bit softer visuals. Another way would be to drop the frame rate. So with Final Fantasy VII Remake, I'm running it at 1080p low settings, but with a 30 frames per second cap. And that'll stabilize the experience, but not be quite as smooth. With other games, you may have to do a mixture. With God of War, I'm using 720p low settings, but with a 40 frames per second cap. And even then, it'll dip below 40 frames per second here and there, but it's still definitely playable. Now, of course, the other option would be to increase the power profile, but let me show you why that may not be a good idea in most cases. Starting here with Horizon Zero Dawn, I'm running at 1080p low settings in performance mode, and I'm getting an average of 30 frames per second. And for me, this is perfectly playable, and it's going to net me about 2 hours of gameplay altogether. Now, if you want to have a higher frame rate, the best way to go about that is to increase the power profile. So we're going to max it all the way up to turbo and then also plug it in. So this is going to be the AC turbo mode. This means it'll provide at least 30 watts of power to the GPU and sometimes even more. In this case, it's actually getting about 38 watts altogether. However, if you look at the frame rate, you can see it did not jump that much. We're looking at about 35 frames per second on average. So essentially, we've gone from 15 watt TDP to 38 watts only to get 5 frames per second. And that's kind of how these chips are modeled, in the fact that you have this diminishing return no matter how much power you throw at it. So I've always found that the performance mode seems to be your best average experience in terms of both battery life as well as power. Let me give you another example. Here's Marvel Spider-Man 1080p low settings in performance mode. It's pulling about 15 watts from the GPU, and we're getting an average of about 32 frames per second. Now, if we swap over to turbo mode but not plugged in, you'll see an average TDP of about 29 or 30 in the GPU. And you're only going to see an improvement of about 1 frame per second on average. This means we're getting about half the battery life we were before, but we're only getting a minimal improvement in actual performance. And so in this scenario, I would recommend keeping the performance mode and then adjusting the settings to get the kind of performance that you're looking for. And that can mean a number of things, adjusting the resolution or the graphical settings or even the frame rate. Regardless, I found that the performance mode seems to work the best with most games. Now, this isn't a catch-all rule because there are some games that will show significant performance increase with additional power. For example, here with Elden Ring at 720p in medium settings, at performance mode, we get an average of about 30 frames per second. If we bump that up to turbo mode, we'll get an average of about 40 frames per second, so that's a pretty big jump. Just bear in mind, it's also going to double the power demand as well. Next, if we plug it in and also keep it on turbo mode, it'll go up quite a bit. We'll actually get an average of about 50 frames per second here. So this is a game where you will see a tangible improvement if you do increase the power load. Now, if you want to improve performance from here, you only really have one option, and that's using the external GPU solution provided by ASUS called the XG Mobile. And this will definitely improve the performance. For example, here with Elden Ring, we're running it at 1080p maximum settings and getting a stable 60 frames per second. So while I have it out, let's talk a little bit about this experience. To start, these are laptop GPUs, so they are not a full desktop class GPU solution. And the one I'm using here is the 2021 model, which is a 3080 Ti. And the setup is very simple. You have the power plug on the bottom, and then you'll need a video out, which is going to be HDMI for me. The only other thing I have plugged in is my USB dongle for my controller so that I can hook it up without having to use Bluetooth. From there, you will use the proprietary connector to plug it into the ROG Ally. And there's a little switch on the plug that you'll flip and then go through the prompts on the screen. And after that, it'll connect to the GPU and you're good to go. Now, I've had this for a few months now and I actually use it all the time. In fact, this has now replaced my desktop PC. And I've never been one to really chase the latest and greatest, and so this gives me just enough boost to be able to feel like a desktop class experience. For example, if I want to play Destiny 2, I can do 1080p in max settings and get well over 100 frames per second, although generally I will play it at a 4K resolution and then 60 frames. And this is also how I've been playing Starfield at home. At 4K and 60 frames per second, it's a really great experience. Now that being said, these GPUs are kind of expensive and not really upgradable either. In fact, this one here is about $1,000. So I don't think this is going to be a great fit for everyone, but it does fit my own personal use case. Okay, that's really about it when it comes to PC gaming. Now let's move over to emulation. We're not going to spend a lot of time on the very lightweight stuff, but as you can imagine, playing these games in silent mode will work just fine. You're also going to get some pretty great battery life. We'll talk about that in the next section. Now, as we work our way up to the more complicated systems, you might be surprised to find which ones can still play at that lower performance mode. Basically, all of your old 3D-based systems, Sega Saturn, Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, those will be just fine. And a good amount of GameCube games will actually play at silent mode even when upscaled up to 1080p. In fact, I would say the vast majority of these games will play at a lower power profile. Now, there are some games that will require more. For example, F-Zero GX is one of the harder games to emulate, but at 1080p you can still play it in performance mode. Now, PlayStation 2 is a little bit harder to emulate on this system. I found that there are some games that will play in silent mode, but the vast majority of them will require performance mode, or about a 15-watt TDP. And I would say that performance mode is going to be the average requirement for most of these PS2 games. However, there are other games that will require more juice to run at full speed. I found that the top 10% of games, those like Burnout Revenge and God of War, will require turbo mode just to be able to play fully. And also bear in mind this is at a 1080p upscale, so if you wanted to lower the resolution, you can get better performance that way as well. Either way, PlayStation 2 is going to be totally playable here, but you will have to adjust the power profile accordingly. Now, the Nintendo Wii U emulator is actually a lot more performant, and so because of that, you can play the vast majority of Wii U games in silent mode. And most of these games will run just fine at their native 720p or 1080p resolution depending on the game. Of course, the hardest game to emulate in the catalog is Breath of the Wild, but this one can still do pretty good in performance mode. You'll have to drop the frames per second cap to 40, and even then it'll dip down every once in a while, but all the same, I would say this is a perfectly enjoyable experience. Sticking with Nintendo, we're going to do 3DS next. Now, the Citra emulation team now officially supports the Vulkan backend with their Windows client. And so that's what I'm testing here at a 3x resolution. I found that all the games that I tried actually played really well in silent mode. I would get some dips here and there when shaders were caching, but all the same, I would definitely be comfortable playing most games at this lower power profile. And of course, if you need to, you can always up the power profile for something that's a little bit harder to play. Either way, yes, 3DS is completely playable on this device. And finally, capping out the Nintendo systems, we have Nintendo Switch. And off the bat, I found that performance here is significantly worse than it was on the Z1 Extreme version of the ROG Ally. To start, I had to adjust the settings for handheld mode, and then basically every single game needed to be played in a turbo power profile. However, after I made those adjustments, I found that most Nintendo Switch games actually played at a pretty good speed. It wasn't a full 60 frames per second all of the time, but I would consider most of these games to be playable. However, I would say that maybe the top 25% of games, those that are harder to emulate, will struggle. For example, Super Mario Odyssey gave me an average of about 50 frames per second. I would still consider this to be playable, especially if you turn on that 120 Hz and the variable refresh rate, but it's not going to be a perfect 60 frames per second experience. Even when having it plugged in, I still wasn't really successful. I got about 52 frames per second average. So if you're looking specifically for Nintendo Switch emulation, this may not be the best choice, especially considering the fact that all of these are playing in handheld mode anyway. This is the first emulated system that we've touched upon here in this video where there is a significant difference between the Z1 Extreme and the Z1. Okay, let's move on to the next system, starting with the Xbox. And the performance here is somewhat mixed. I found that some games will play just fine in performance mode, although you'll have to play them at a native resolution. Other games, even at a native resolution, will not play at full speed unless you enable turbo mode. And so it's really going to depend on the game and how hard it is to emulate. One other thing you could do is if you turn on turbo mode, you can also adjust the resolution. For example, with Halo Combat Evolved, this one plays fine in performance mode at a 1x resolution, but if you want to have some sharper graphics, you could up it to a 2x resolution and then turn on turbo mode and it'll run relatively well. It's a pretty similar experience with Xbox 360. There are some games that will run in performance mode, although you will get some slowdown here and there. Crackdown, for example, will run at about 30 frames per second but dip down once you have a lot of things going on. Other games will essentially require you to play in turbo mode just to be able to get to a full frame rate. That's going to include games like Project Gotham Racing 4 as well as the original Forza Horizon. And this emulator is still a work in progress, so it's hard to say that every 360 game will play because it really comes down to compatibility. Moving on, we're going to try PlayStation 3. I thought there would be a night and day difference between these two chipsets, but it turns out that even having fewer cores and threads didn't make a huge difference with this emulator. Certain games like Dead or Alive 5 played at full speed no problem in performance mode. Even the harder to play games like Devil May Cry actually played pretty well, although I did have to turn on turbo mode just to get to a fuller frame rate. At the end of the day, I actually was pretty impressed with the PlayStation performance on the Z1 model. To give you a more apples to apples comparison, here is Ratchet & Clank Quest for Booty. I'm playing it in performance mode and you can see that I'm getting an average of about 55 frames per second. There's definitely some moments where it'll play at 60 FPS, but it'll also dip down to about the mid 40s here and there. But all told, unless you're looking for a perfect gameplay experience, I would say this is still pretty playable. Now if we play the exact same game and settings but on the Z1 Extreme model, you can see here that there's a little bit of a difference. Most of the time it will be at 60 FPS, but it'll still dip down. So there's definitely a difference between the two when it comes to performance, but at the end of the day, I would still say this game is playable. Next, let's do a quick comparison between these two models. And right off the bat, I will say when trying to play AAA games, you will see a significant difference. And I think a lot of this comes down to the GPU processing power on the Z1 Extreme. For example, with Final Fantasy VII Remake, I'm playing it at 1080p low settings. And you can see there's about a 20 frames per second average here, even though we're using the exact same settings and power profile. And I think this makes sense considering the fact that we're at a GPU bottleneck with this game. And because the Z1 Extreme has essentially 3 to almost 4 times the processing power in terms of teraflops, it makes sense that the performance here is going to be quite a bit better. And the same is going to be said for other GPU reliant games. Cult of the Lamb is a great example. This is a game that's also very GPU reliant, and again we're getting between 15 and 20 frames per second difference with the Z1 Extreme. Now when it comes to more lightweight gaming, then the differences here are not quite as stark. With certain games like Celeste, there was no difference when it came to performance, but the power demand was quite a bit different. In this case, the Z1 Extreme required less power than the Z1 to do the exact same performance. However, it's not super cut and dry, and it really depends on the game. For example, the exact opposite was true with Shredder's Revenge. This one required an additional 2 watts of power on the Z1 Extreme compared to the Z1. So it's kind of hard to say that one's going to be better than the other. It really will depend on the game. Now, there was also some interesting findings when it came to emulation. Starting with Breath of the Wild on the Wii U, I found that they both had similar performance, although the Z1 did require a little bit more power to get there. And again, that makes sense to me considering that this chip is less powerful. When it came to Nintendo Switch emulation, I found that the performance here was a little bit mixed. On some games like Super Mario 3D World, they actually performed exactly the same between the two chips. However, with the more demanding games like Link's Awakening, it was a night and day difference. Using the exact same settings, the Z1 had lower performance by about 5 frames per second. And it was using more power to get there, about 11 watts altogether. So it's really going to depend on the system and game, but there was never really a time where the Z1 was a clear benefit over the Z1 Extreme. For the most part, they were either pretty much locked dead even, or the Z1 Extreme was quite a bit better. Okay, and finally for our last section, we're going to talk about battery life. To start, we're going to bring up my findings from the original ROG Ally review that I made earlier this year. And if you've never seen this before, I will try a variety of different games at different power profiles to see what kind of battery life we can expect at those different profiles. Now, since making that original review video, there have been quite a few BIOS updates to the ROG Ally. So I wanted to run my tests again just to make sure we're using the same baseline. So here are the results of that updated test. Of note here, I wasn't able to retest Elden Ring and Horizon Zero Dawn. It's a long story, but basically the SD card reader on my original ROG Ally just stopped working, so I wasn't able to pull the games from the SD card. In addition, I didn't want to spend half a day re-downloading those games onto my SSD. So as a result, I worked with the games I had already installed, which included the Final Fantasy VII Remake. And here I found a 4-minute difference between the two, and honestly I think that's just a very natural variation, so I don't think that's a big deal. Same thing with the far right when I played Paper Mario on the GameCube. This one had a 2-minute difference, which I would consider to be just trivial at that point. The main difference I saw was with SteamWorld Dig 2. This one I played at 1080p and 120Hz, but in silent mode. Here I got an additional 37 minutes from my original testing. And honestly, I think that makes sense because ASUS really tried to push an improvement to the lower power profiles. And given the fact that emulation is more CPU bound, it makes sense that Paper Mario didn't have a change where SteamWorld Dig 2 did. So I'm going to consider these findings to be our current baseline with the ROG Ally Z1 Extreme. So that's what I used when comparing the Z1 that we're reviewing here today. And here's a look at the results. Now this is actually surprisingly complex, so we're going to start with Paper Mario and work our way to the left. To start, you can see there's a pretty significant improvement right here, 31 additional minutes. So I think there's a few things going on here with the GameCube emulation. Number one, this doesn't require a lot of cores and threads. Instead, single core performance is actually going to be more important, so I think that might be where we're getting these battery gains. When it comes to SteamWorld Dig 2, we still saw an improvement overall of about 15 minutes. And I'm not really sure what's going on here, but it is nice to see that we are getting improved battery gains when it comes to lightweight PC gaming as well as emulation. Now moving over, we have Horizon Zero Dawn. You can see there's only a 2-minute difference between these two, but you can see that the average frame rate dropped from 40 frames per second down to 33. So while yes, you are getting about the same amount of battery life, you are not getting the same performance between these two. And it's a similar story with Final Fantasy VII Remake. On the Z1 Extreme, this one ran at 60 frames per second, but here I was only getting about 50. However, because I was getting over 48 frames per second, I decided to run it in a 120Hz mode. This would turn on variable refresh rate to give it a smoother experience. Now running this screen at 120Hz is going to cost more battery than 60, and so that's why I think we're getting a lower battery performance here by 12 minutes. And then finally with Elden Ring, this one dropped from 50 frames per second at the same settings down to 36 frames. So we're definitely getting a drop in overall performance, but we are getting a slight bump when it comes to battery life. So in summary, when it comes to performance between the Z1 and the Z1 Extreme, I did see some improvements at the lower level, but when trying to play more high-end games, I found that the battery life difference was about the same. However, the performance was significantly worse by an average of about 10 frames per second. Okay, and with all that testing out of the way, let's go ahead and start wrapping up. And the primary question right here is whether or not that $100 price savings is going to be worth it with the $599 version of the ROG Ally. In the way I see it, it's really going to come down to you and your specific use case. If you plan on only playing lightweight games or emulating up to GameCube and PS2, then yes, it seems like the performance here is just about the same. And so yes, I think that you can save about $100 while playing in those categories while getting a very similar performance. However, when trying to play AAA titles or those that are more GPU reliant, you will find a significant performance difference between the two. In addition, I think that as more games come out in the future, the Z1 Extreme model will probably be more future-proof. So the way I see it, if you're looking to play more high-end games or you plan on using the ROG Ally for years to come, then the Z1 Extreme is probably going to be worth that additional $100. Either way, I think it's nice to see that we do have the choice when it comes to performance. If you want to save that $100 because you don't really need that extreme performance, then yeah, I think the Z1 model might be a great fit. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments down below. Is the $599 model the one for you, or are you holding out for something else? As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.